Ivanoeva, and I'm director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And I'm very happy to welcome you to today's event that I will co-moderate with the program on Central Asia Innovation Fellow, Adam Wozniak, who will be helping me and who will be coordinating the questions. And as promised, today we will talk about the past, present, and very importantly, the future of US Central Asia cooperation in the nuclear sphere, and that, of course, has the two interlinked but kind of very distinct sides, the military side and the civilian side, the proliferation, non-proliferation, and nuclear energy. As many of you know, non-proliferation was a foundational pillar of US-Kazakhstan relations. Americans played a crucial role in making sure Kazakhstan goes non-nuclear and that it benefits from this decision. All 5 Central Asian states were involved in the non-Lugar cooperative threat reduction program that our distinguished speaker, Ambassador Laura Holgate, coordinated at the Department of Defense. And the 5 states set up a Central Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. And they remain committed to non-proliferation, but the world today is very different. If we compare to the 1990s, the winds seem to be blowing in the sails of proliferation rather than non-proliferation. So I think it will be important for us to discuss today what countries, non-nuclear countries, like Central Asian countries, can do, should do. Also, the United States, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan are very much interested in the development of nuclear energy, and nuclear renaissance is a global phenomenon. We all need more energy for the digital transformation of our economies, our societies, and we need cleaner energy because we want to mitigate climate change, and there is a good complementarity. There is a lot of promise in the partnership between the US and Central Asian states in this sphere. There is a good complementarity. The US has technologies, cutting-edge research, knowledge, very good safety regulations, and on the Central Asian side, we have rich reserves of uranium and also eagerness to develop these technologies. So there is great promise in that area. So let's talk today about this partnership, the promises and the challenges of this partnership. And we have amazing speakers with us today for this conversation. Let me introduce them in the order I'll ask them to speak. I already started introducing Ambassador Laura Holgate, who is an American diplomat who served as the US ambassador to the United Nations international organizations in Vienna and to the International Atomic Energy Agency from 2022 to 2025, and previously from 2016 to 2017. Her career has included serving as special coordinator for cooperative threat reduction at the Department of Defense, as already mentioned, directing the US Department of Energy's Office of Fissile Materials Disposition, and serving as the founding vice president of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, leading its Russia New Independent States programs. She was also special assistant to the president and senior director for weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and threat reduction on the National Security Council, where she oversaw and coordinated the development of national policies to reduce global threats from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. She is currently president of LSHH International Advises, and she also has non-resident appointments at the Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy, and also here at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And here, let me express gratitude to the Belfer Center managing the Atom Project for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you so much, Ambassador Holgate, for joining us. And we will also hear from Aydar Tainov, who is a senior program manager at the International Science and Technology Center, specializing in international cooperation, nuclear non-proliferation, and nuclear energy development. He previously served at the International Atomic Energy Agency, where he supported nuclear infrastructure development for newcomer countries and contributed to international initiatives on nuclear security and capacity building. He also worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan on disarmament and non-proliferation, and at Kazatomprom, the world's largest uranium producer, leading international cooperation and strategic projects across the nuclear fuel cycle. Thank you so much, Aydar, for joining us today. So, without further ado, let's go to the discussion. But first, let me tell our audiences that you can post your questions. We will have a Q&A time. You can post them here in the webinar in the Q&A. Well, there is a Q&A function, or if you watch us on YouTube, you can also put your questions there, and our team will give us your questions. We'll try to address as many as we can. So let's start the discussion. So can I go to you, Ambassador Holgate, and let's maybe start a little bit with the past. The 1990s can be described as the golden age of non-proliferation, and you coordinated the cooperative threat reduction program that was massively successful. What were the key ingredients of the success on the American side? What hopes you had back then? What materialized? What didn't materialize? Where did things go right? Where did they go wrong? And now the world seems to be moving in the wrong direction. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, good morning, and thanks to the Davis Center and the Belfer Center for co-sponsoring and gathering this interesting conversation. I'm always happy to talk about Kazakhstan. It was the first of the former Soviet republics that I visited when I started working on these issues in the early 90s. And has remained a country with which I've had extensive and friendly, constructive engagements over my career. So that's a real warm point in my personal history. In many ways, the Kazakhstani experience reflects this intertwining that is inevitable between the weapons applications of nuclear and the energy applications of nuclear, or the non-energy peaceful uses applications. And it goes back to being the home to the former Soviet test site, and the opposition that grew at the end of the 80s, in part inspired by the public outcry after Chernobyl. So there you have a nuclear energy thing, very negative thing that's influencing the public outcry and ultimately the political bravery of President Nazarbayev, who would become president, to, in 1986, start to say, no, the Soviet Union was not going to be allowed to test weapons in the Soviet Socialist Republic of Kazakhstan. That would be in the United States, like the state of Nevada, standing up and telling Washington, no, you can't test nuclear weapons here anymore. It was a dramatic move. And that it had a lot to do with the large-scale human health impacts and environmental contamination that came from those tests. But that really, as you said, Narges, right, quite properly, that non-proliferation is a foundational aspect of the Kazakhstani state. And that was one of the very first things that President Nazarbayev did after independence, was officially close the test site and take a number of steps that brought Kazakhstan into a clear status of non-proliferation. It wasn't immediate. And, an excellent book called Atomic Step by someone also named Kasyanova. It was details the skillful diplomacy with which President Nazarbayev didn't immediately make the promises that were hoped for from the West around the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but used that as a lever to make sure that Kazakhstan would be supported in that decision, supported politically in terms of security promises, and supported technically and financially in terms of managing what former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, one of the fathers of the non-nuclear cooperative threat reduction program, he called it the post-Cold War WMD hangover. And this was in the form of, missiles in silos, in the form of the test site needing to be cleaned up, in the form of the material that was associated with Project Sapphire, one of the most dramatic instances of non-proliferation and of securing material that was at risk, that could have been used, in this case, highly enriched uranium, that could have been used in a nuclear weapon had it been handled in an inappropriate way. U.S. and U.S. and Kazakhstan cooperated under the CTR program also to store plutonium-bearing fuel from the Soviet-era breeder reactor, the BN-350, that had been closed down, and also with on research reactor conversion and HEU removals from research reactors and conversion to non-weapons usable fuel, and then blend down of fresh fuel from the BN-350. So a number of steps, very concrete steps that represent permanent elimination of potential risks associated with materials and infrastructure in Kazakhstan. Kind of capping that decade, as you say, golden decade of non-proliferation, U.S. and Kazakhstan, and shifting the dialogue a little bit to some of the energy part of the relationship. The U.S. and Kazakhstan signed an agreement for nuclear cooperation in 1999. Often that's a prelude to transferring U.S. technology, peaceful technology, to another country. In this case, the interesting thing was it was mainly about the basis for transferring Kazakhstani uranium to the United States for use in our nuclear energy programs. Then came key milestones like ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, Kazakhstani leadership in the Central Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, which was signed in September and came into force in September 2006. And by 2009, Kazakhstan was the world's largest uranium supplier. And last year, they supplied 40% of the uranium globally, which is an incredibly powerful aspect. In 2019, Kazakhstan became host to the IAEA's Low Enriched Uranium Bank, which is another piece of the non-proliferation puzzle as a way to eliminate pressures and arguments that would relate to nations adding enrichment capability to peaceful nuclear aspects. And it was very much in the context of the Iranian arguments that were located in that time. Then the bank is intended to provide a backup, kind of an insurance policy against political disruptions of fuel supply. So in that way, it contributes very strongly, and it builds on this history of non-proliferation benefits. So I can pause there, and because most of the rest of the things I want to say have to do with kind of very recent history in the energy side of things. So I'll leave that for another set of questions.
Well, Laura, can I just follow up with one question? So it was a very successful partnership. Were there any things that didn't go as well as you hoped? And you mentioned the non-proliferation, nuclear weapon free zone, for example. We know that it wasn't, ratified, right, by the U.S. side. And like, if you can talk a little bit, like what you think maybe didn't happen on the American side, or kind of where your hopes were not, were not met.
Well, I would have to say, I think, I really don't have um, any like gaps in my wish list. I will say there was a lot of learning in the early days between the United States and Kazakhstan. Very different negotiating styles, very different communication styles, and just and the way the Congress shaped this cooperative threat reduction program created a lot of challenges when you go to overseas to implement it. Things like the Buy American Act that forced the Pentagon to prioritize expenditures in the United States. It took a little while to develop, this concept of an integrating contractor that could then do subcontracting with local companies and help build up that expertise, business expertise, even in Kazakhstan by nature of working with U.S. firms. So, I think there was a whole set of issues around defense conversion that were part of the original non-Lugar cooperative threat reduction program that I think, frankly, didn't work very well anywhere. They did, they worked successfully. There were a couple of success stories, but trying to create a capitalist-based industry approach in any of these economies that were in this medium ground of, at that time, capitalist aspirations, but still Soviet structures, and that whole transition phase with a lot of other bigger economic challenges. The notion that you can do defense conversion in that context, in retrospect, was kind of not, not going to be successful. It was a worthy effort, and it was a sincere effort to try to address the economic pressures that might lead to continued involvement in weapons of mass destruction related industries. And so you want to be respectful of the people that are working there, of the need for them to continue to earn a living. But the notion that you can create, small businesses essentially on a capitalist model in the middle of a very, at best, proto-capitalist economy was probably one of the least successful elements of that relationship.
But overall, it was just so visionary and such a right thing to do.
Well, it was, if you think about it, what I like to say about that program is it was crazy until it was necessary.
Okay.
I mean, 1990, to talk about spending money to help the Soviet Union do things with its materials, of helping their economies, of helping employ their people. I mean, that was nuts in 1990. And then suddenly in 1992, it was like, oh my gosh, deterrence is not going to solve this problem at this time.
I hope we are on the verge of something like that, because we are in times of uncertainty, great uncertainty, and we do need a vision.
We need to be thinking big about things that could happen,
in a very bad place.
If something's meaningful changed drastically, that we have an idea to push to. Exactly.
Yes. Thank you so much. Aidar, can I go to you? Laura already started us on the kind of, in listing these main milestones of the cooperation. From the vantage point of today, how would you assess Kazakhstan's role in the global non-proliferation processes, and what are the key challenges today?
First of all, let me please express my gratitude to the organizers of this event, and also highlight that it's a true honor to join this discussion alongside Ambassador Laura Holgate. So, as it was mentioned, Kazakhstan was like a few countries in the world have shaped global nuclear history as profoundly and as constructively as Kazakhstan. Back in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhstan inherited the world's fourth largest nuclear arsenal. It's like a very important fact. And the country faced a defining choice. not just about the weapon. In my judgment, it was about the identity of the country. So Kazakhstan chose disarmament. So Kazakhstan chose the cooperation, and Kazakhstan chose the responsibility. And the decision continued to define its role in the world today. So from my perspective, having worked in the government, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs side, Ministry of Defense side, and then in industry, in Kazatomprom and international intergovernmental organizations like IAEA and now in ISTC, I can say that Kazakhstan's contribution to global non-proliferation has been both symbolic and deeply practical. On the symbolic side, the closure of the Semipalatinsk nuclear weapon testing site and the negotiation of the nuclear weapon, leadership in the establishment of the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. Those steps created a political credibility that still resonates today. But perhaps more importantly, Kazakhstan translated this into a practical contribution. As it was mentioned, now Kazakhstan is hosting the International Atomic Energies Agency's low-enriched uranium bank. As it was mentioned, it's like a very unique facility, the only we have in the world. And now Kazakhstan acts as a reliable global supplier of natural uranium. And we like to say in Kazakhstan that one of the third of all nuclear power plants around the globe is fed by Kazakh uranium. And in different places, whether it's New York City or Vienna, Kazakhstan is supporting these all nuclear security and safeguard initiatives around the globe. And Kazakhstan promotes peaceful use of nuclear energy under these straight international frameworks. So the country is not just a participant in a non-proliferation regime. So it is one of the anchors. However, the environment today, as we all know, is fundamentally different from the optimism of 1990s. So we are witnessing erosion of arms control frameworks, increasing the geopolitical fragmentation, growing competition in nuclear technologies, and renewed interest in the nuclear weapon in some regions. In this context, the challenge is no longer only a non-proliferation. It's maintaining trust, because the non-proliferation regimes ultimately depends not only on treaties, but on confidence between the states. So from Central Asia perspective, I would highlight some key challenges, listing them it's balancing energy security and non-proliferation, technology and supply chain competition, and the third is the human capacity and institutional development. So firstly, countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and recently even Kyrgyzstan also joined this discussion when they actively considering nuclear power, including small modular reactors. It creates a dual responsibility to meet growing energy demand and decarbonization goals, and while maintaining the highest standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation. So this balance is not easy, but it's achievable. So secondly, we are entering to the era of competing nuclear ecosystem, if I can say that way. So the different reactor technologies, different fuel cycle arrangements, different regulatory and governance models brings so Central Asia has the key question how to remain open, diversified, and sovereign in the decision making. So thirdly, regarding the human capacity and institutional development, nuclear energy is not just in technology. It's about the people and institutions developing independent regulatory bodies, skillful workforce, and strong safety culture. These are all relies or depends on the international cooperation, and it's essential. This brings me to an important part of the partnership, particularly with the United States. Historically, the US and Central Asian cooperation has been instrumental through the programs, as it was mentioned, like a cooperative threat reduction and many, many others. Today, these cooperations is evolving, supporting SMR development, strengthening regulatory frameworks in the countries. So enhancing this nuclear safety culture and investing to the Central Asian human capital. Initiatives like the United States Department of State's FIRST program demonstrates that these partnerships between the region and the United States is not only continuing but adapting to the newer realities. And it's critical to highlight it because the future of nuclear energy must be built on trust, transparency, and the shared standards. So I see Central Asia not as a peripheral player, but as a strategic bridge between East and West, between resource supply and energy demand, between legacy system and future technologies. Particularly, Kazakhstan has potential to become a hub of nuclear fuel cycle services, a platform for international cooperation, and a model for a responsible nuclear development. So let me conclude with that Kazakhstan's decision in 1919 was about giving up a nuclear weapon, but in reality, it was about something much bigger. It was about choosing a future based on cooperation over confrontation. Today, as Kazakhstan faces new uncertainties, that choice remain high relevance. The question is no longer whether non-proliferation works. The question is, can Kazakhstan adapt it to more complex and competitive world? I believe with the right partnership, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very rich. You enlisted really important points and challenges. Can I first ask you both on the NPT regime, right? Would you agree that it's somewhat in crisis now? And what can countries like Kazakhstan, who and Uzbekistan and other Central Asian states who went non-nuclear, right? Thinking that that's the best way to ensure their security, and it's kind of that's the world seem to be moving in that direction. What should they do now? How they can kind of help the regime, and kind of Kazakhstan insists on the negative assurances, right? What's the correct name, so that non-nuclear states receive these assurances? And so should we double the effort, or it's sort of now maybe we should kind of focus on other things, and kind of what countries like ours can do to help the world move in the right direction? I don't know. It's a probably big. It's a very big question. Laura, maybe we can go to you first.
Well, yes, I certainly agree with you that the NPT is in a challenging moment, and especially as we face the review conference coming up next year. next month. And where for the first time there is no boundary on the nuclear acquisition or nuclear programs of both the P5 and the countries who never signed the NPT or who left the NPT and have nuclear weapons programs. So we see, an increase in weapons acquisition across the board, whether it's in numbers or whether it's in infrastructure. In the US, it's primarily about infrastructure and delivery systems. It's not talking about necessarily a lot of new weapons, but recognizing that many of our missiles and aircraft are 30, 40, 50 years old. So the US, that's taking place in kind of a delivery system focus. In Russia, it's taking place, again, not necessarily numerically, but qualitatively, of new types of weapons, new ways to use nuclear explosive power in new types of weapons. And in China, you're just seeing just a giant buildup of their existing weapons capabilities numerically. We see buildups in India and Pakistan as well. So the little bit in France and the UK, but it's not that nobody's going down. And that's a really scary moment, and very much contrary to the pledges that the P5 made in the legally binding commitments. Let's not just say pledges, legally binding commitments that the P5 undertook in the NPT. And it's very understandable that countries are disappointed in that, beyond disappointed, angry, frustrated, and so on. That is not going to change. The structure, the pressures that are causing that situation are not going to change between now and next month. That's going to be the reality that the delegates face. And there's going to be a lot of anger out there. My hope is that, whereas in recent years, recent review conferences, that anger has been pushed mainly on the US and Russia. That people are saying, who are watching this more closely than I am, that there seems to be a recognition that China is actually really moving so quickly and, going well beyond any even, statement of restraint. And that some of the anger and frustration be directed towards China. The interesting thing is, of course, authoritarian governments are not very susceptible to pressure, either from their own publics or from external voices. So it's hard to know to what degree that anger will actually change anybody. It's hard to be optimistic that anger will change the trajectory. So I think that's where the other two pieces of the NPT really need to be highlighted and lifted up. And this is where Kazakhstan, has an incredibly powerful story of their decision to join the NPT as a non-weapon state, has provided them with a level of nuclear capability and trust, to really echo Idar's really important point on that, globally, and to recognize that the choice they made has generated the success that Kazakhstan has had as a nation, and economically, socially, all the different ways that Kazakhstan has really grown and developed, and that would have been impossible had they tried to keep the weapons they had and then become a pariah state, become the South Africa of Central Asia. That would have been completely contrary to President Nazarbayev's dreams of the future of Kazakhstan. So I think that the presence of Kazakhstan, the visibility of Kazakhstan in the conversation, reminds people that this commitment was beneficial. And then also Kazakhstan, because of its history, has been well seized to enjoy currently and have incredible open possibility in the future of the benefits of the peaceful atom, whether it's the research reactors and the medical treatments, that are possible in Kazakhstan because of the facilities that are there. The training that goes on, the employment possibilities for elements of the fuel cycle, whether it's the fuel fabrication, conversion aspects of participating in the global nuclear fuel cycle. These are all things that have been beneficial to Kazakhstan and would not have been available had we not had the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That global trade in peaceful nuclear technologies would have not been available to them or to any of us. And so I think helping remind countries who are frustrated by the lack of progress on disarmament that the other two pieces, that having confidence that your neighbors are not developing nuclear weapons because of the safeguards structures that the IAEA holds, and being able to simultaneously benefit from the peaceful atom, that those on a day-to-day basis are the two most relevant aspects of the NPT for the vast majority of countries. The nuclear weapons in the hands of the P5 are not aimed at the global south. They are aimed at each other. They are not. Now, we can have a whole interesting international relations theory discussion about what the mere possession of those weapons means for, global power, even if they're never used. But fundamentally, most of the world is not threatened by those weapons. They would be threatened by weapons in their neighborhood. And that's what the NPT provides, is confidence that those weapons in their neighborhood are not happening.
Thank you so much. Yes, Aydar, can I go to you for your take?
Yeah, from the Central Asian countries' perspective, definitely at the agenda in coming kind of a months, there will be definitely the 30 years of anniversary of the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, and generally, like the approach of Central Asian countries using the multivectoral approach will also cover the matters on the NPT and nuclear non-proliferation itself. We are observing quite interesting, developments coming not only from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but Kyrgyzstan is also actively involved in these all newer initiatives. Generally, Kazakhstan is a huge supporter of different initiatives, whether it's in sense of the IAEA or larger scale, and contributes to these all discussions on safeguards, nuclear security and nuclear safety. And very shortly, I would highlight that points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Q&A. I have plenty of questions, but let's go to Q&A. Adam?
Yes, thank you both, Ambassador Holgate and Aydar, for your wonderful introductory remarks and for answering some of those preliminary questions. I wanted to take the conversation in a slightly different direction now, kind of thinking about the present and also the future. And kind of one question I had for Ambassador Holgate was, we hear about the talk of this nuclear renaissance right now. Many countries, and of course, Central Asia is right there in the middle of this, are wanting to build nuclear power plants. And nuclear is, it's seen as something that can really contribute to decarbonization, energy security, development. So it has all these wonderful benefits that are being noticed right now. But at the same time, more reactors means more countries with nuclear materials, more facilities to secure, more opportunities for things to go wrong. And I wanted to ask, how do you think about this trade-off between the benefits and the risks?
Well, thanks for that question. It's a really important, complicating, and fascinating one. I think a lot of it can be accomplished. That balancing can be accomplished by or we've achieved that balance in the kind of nuclear energy technologies that currently that generally currently exist in the world. Large gigawatt scale reactors powered by low enriched uranium that is created in a small number of countries on a reliable basis, and that in many countries is simply stored pending a future geologic repository. There are certainly countries that have attempted to close the fuel cycle. Unfortunately, those have all been failures in that they have created massive quantities of separated plutonium that can't be reused in their fuel cycle. And so they actually are creating proliferation challenges globally from that production of additional plutonium. I think so. One key way to keep that to hold those two concepts in balance is to maintain an open fuel cycle, to avoid reprocessing technologies that generate more plutonium than can be used, because that plutonium stockpiles are growing, and they're growing because of civilian programs, not anything to do with the military. As Idar mentioned, safety, security, and safeguards have to be built into these reactors as we look at new reactor types, and we need to think about fuel cycle choices there as well. The reactors that we have were largely designed before 9/11, before Fukushima. And so there's this perception that improving safety and improving security is really expensive, because the improvements that have been made based on the insights from those two major shocks to our nuclear energy system have had to be glued on after the fact. Now we have new reactor designs that have a chance to bake in those principles by the design of the reactor to make it more safe. And this is where a lot of the focus of these new small modular reactors are coming, is they're talking about smaller amounts of material, which just by definition creates less material that could be scattered in some kind of an accident or incident. They're talking about forms of fuel that are very challenging to interact with, at least some of the reactor designs. Some of these reactor designs are actually quite a bit more dangerous. So I think technology selection that incorporates understandings around safety and security and safeguardability. Again, from a safeguards point of view, our current reactors have giant fuel assemblies that require a crane and multiple carefully trained people to move. If you move to a smaller reactor, you may be moving to smaller fuel elements, different types of fuel elements. And so what does that mean for safeguards? Some of these, the high temperature gas reactors, some of them are using pebbles. Those pebbles are going to be moving throughout the reactor during the course of the time. Is that a problem? Maybe not, but it's different. And so making sure that these reactors are designed recognizing where cameras are going to need to be installed in the reactor, where inspection points are going to need to be, where inspectors are going to need access to certain operational elements of the reactor. Doing that up front is really going to be important. And then countries who are looking to acquire these reactors have a responsibility to make sure that they're sending that signal to the potential suppliers. Security is another issue. When the designers are building and designing reactors, they're not necessarily thinking about the operational burden or the operational implications of those design choices. You can design a reactor in a way that says, I want to minimize the number of humans needed to secure this reactor. And I'm going to make design choices about where I put different parts of that reactor and how accessible they are and so on. But if you don't do that, you can end up saying, okay, well, now I've got a reactor. It's a small reactor, but it needs 20 people to keep it secure. And the burden of that then falls on the operator, not on the designer. And so the countries that are going to be the operators really need to be sending these signals that they want these concepts to be incorporated into the design and baked in to the design process So that's, to me, that's really how we manage that. But there's another really important point, and you mentioned it, Adam, in your question around the how many resources we're going to need to inspect these new reactors. And so the IAEA is going to need more resources, more technology, more people, to maintain the level of confidence that we have. Back to what I was saying earlier, that our neighbors are not using a weapon, an energy program to clandestinely create weapons. And so that's going to need to be a real change, including in US policy, on this zero growth approach for UN organizations. I would say not all UN organizations are created equal, and the IAEA's ability to be effective, not just in safeguards, but across all of the things that it does to support peaceful deployment of nuclear energy, is going to need to be resourced adequately. And there's a lot of countries who currently hold to this zero growth, and they're going to have to figure out how to get past that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this, I think IDAR as well, about the safety culture. And I think that's a very important piece of, growing nuclear in Central Asia. I wonder, and maybe both of you can take this question, if you could talk a bit more about the safety culture that the US brings to the table, why that's important, and, why should countries strongly consider it when looking to build nuclear reactors? Maybe Idar, if you wanted to take that first.
So generally, when we are looking to the Central Asia now, like countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, looks to the nuclear power like newer programs. And one of the key, I would say, requirements for implementing or embarking to that nuclear power programs is to being responsible and implementing these all IAEA safety standards, which comes with the one of the main parts of the establishment of the responsible nuclear safety culture, bringing in a different levels, whether it's like a leadership, decision makers, or just an employers of the regulatory body or the operator. So it's a huge a system or that should be covering each other and supporting each other. And without such a system of safety culture, such a huge mega projects of nuclear power plants would not be possible. So there are certain a level of the understanding of the nuclear safety culture in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, since they both inherited a lot of nuclear scientific institution or uranium mining entities, and they all face and implement in certain level, but having the nuclear power plant, it brings it in a different level, definitely.
Well, from the U.S. perspective, certainly the U.S. companies believe that the long history of extremely safe nuclear operations of U.S. reactors brings with it a culture that will be transferred to new reactor types and new exports. Along with that, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been partnering with regulators all over the world, including in Central Asia, to help improve the regulatory infrastructure. I think IDAN has really put a really important aspect on the history of Central Asia vis-a-vis bad decisions, unsafe decisions made in the past. But I also think it's a struggle to really create a truly independent regulator coming out of the Soviet regulatory culture. Rostechnadzor is not an independent regulator. And when they say that they're going to come, in some countries, not in Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan doesn't need it. There is a regulator there. But even Kazakhstan's regulator in an independence the leadership has changed back and forth, often with the nuclear industry. So there's been some concerns about regulatory capture. And so Kazakhstan's regulator will definitely need to be strengthened over time. But Rostechnadzor comes to countries and says, okay, well, you don't have a regulator, we'll license it for you. And that is just, not a path to a safety culture in a country that needs to own and operate these reactors for generations. So I think it's really important. I will say I'm a little worried about recent changes that have been made in the status of the U.S. regulator, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that risk chipping away at that independence and chipping away at the high standards and quality. And so that's something I'm speaking out about here in the U.S. And I hope that does not weaken the U.S. ability to influence regulatory capabilities elsewhere, because certainly regulatory cooperation ideally goes hand in hand with nuclear technology exports.
Let me flag here the excellent podcast you did with the Columbia Energy Exchange recently, where you talk about regulations and other aspects of nuclear energy development. We received a number of questions about Russia and China. We know that Russia is becoming kind of one of the main partners, or maybe the main partner. And here I'm interested in what you think, whether Russia would be the main partner of Central Asian states in nuclear energy development. What are the pros? What are the pros and cons? And Aidar, you talked about the importance of diversifying cooperation, and there are pros and cons of that too as well. It's not, in practice, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's it makes sense in the light of our multi-vector foreign policy, but it's not easy. It's not easy to do. So I was wondering kind of what you think, and maybe here let's start with you, Aidar.
So when you look to the nuclear cluster, so-called, that President Tokayev announced, it covers multiple projects, nuclear power plant projects. So it's based on the multivectoral approach, balancing these all relations between neighbor Russia, China, and these very close cooperation with the Western countries. Having the very first projects with two units with Rosatom, at the same day, Kazakhstan's NEPIO, so-called Nuclear Energy Program Implementation Organization, the Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan for Atomic Energy, announced last year in June that Rosatom is going to be a leader of the first international consortium for the first nuclear power plant of Kazakhstan. And at the same day, they announced that China is going to lead the second consortium in the same location. It means at least 2 gigawatts capacity nuclear power plant is approximately 2 gigawatt capacity nuclear power plant goes to the Russian, and the same capacity goes to the a Chinese CNNC. And at the same time, also we are all aware of the third project, and generally expecting that probably it will be also balanced, and there are some different locations that are assessing by the IEA's experts, including with the national institutes in Kazakhstan. So it's more about that, but definitely we know that Kazakhstan government relies on the huge nuclear industries they have based on the nuclear science and uranium mining site they have, whether it's National Nuclear Center in Kurchatov City, Institute of Nuclear Physics in Almaty, or Kazatomprom with its 14 uranium mining entities they have. And there is a huge community of nuclear industry in Kazakhstan. And these all experts now supporting these all three nuclear power plant projects mainly comes from the Kazakhstan's nuclear industry. At the same time, like we can also give an example on other countries like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, but every country's case is very unique.
So I think the interesting thing about Kazakhstan, I mean, the geopolitical realities for Kazakhstan are always going to mean that Russia and China loom large in Kazakhstan's foreign policy, economic policy, partnerships, and so on. So I don't think it's any surprise that the first two nuclear reactor projects are in connection with those two countries. It's also the case that those two countries have a product to sell. For a whole variety of reasons, the U.S. only recently became able to offer a gigawatt scale reactor, the AP1000, that has to do with a trade dispute with the Korean Hydro and who owned property, intellectual property, and so on. So after the very successful cooperation that resulted in the UAE reactors being built on time, on schedule, functioning, doing their job, there was this pause in the U.S. company Westinghouse being able to export, and so now that's been resolved. So at least the U.S. has an offering. But I think the U.S. is going to have a lot more diversity of offers on the small modular reactor. And I've been sitting in meetings between the U.S. Secretary of Energy and his or her Kazakhstani counterpart for almost 20 years now. And every conversation, the Kazakhstani official says, "We want your SMRs, but we want your second one. We don't want your first one." And so right now there are no U.S. SMRs that are operating. We've made enormous strides in the last 2 or 3 years of getting reactors, to the regulatory stage, through the regulatory stage, beginning construction, and so on. But right now the U.S. does not have a proven operating reactor in that kind of SMR size envelope. And so I understand it's difficult for another country to say, okay, we'll take some of those. Now, some countries in Europe are doing that. NuScale is going to be building a reactor in Romania. Holtec is going to be building reactors, I think, in Poland. There's other reactor deals in the works. So there are some countries that are willing to be the first, but most countries are not. They want to see a reactor that they can go visit, they can kick the tires, they can, walk around and understand that it's real, and to see that it can be replicated. The other big challenge when it comes to reactor, choice of partners for countries like Kazakhstan that have limited state capital to invest is how much how much support they can get from their partner on managing those expenses. The U.S., because of our private sector nature, has very limited U.S. government resources to put behind deals. And so just from a pure financial point of view, it's easy to see how a Russian or a Chinese offer might be more attractive. That having been said, I think countries that have partnered with Russia and China on other major infrastructure projects are seeing some of the downsides of those. China in particular, where they tend to bring in their own workforce which creates enormous social and economic disruptions. And then both countries have a tendency to, both Russia and China have a tendency to expect that political alignment will be part of that generational relationship. And you see China pressuring countries where they have port projects or bridge projects or other kinds of major infrastructure to vote alongside them in the UN or to take various positions on geopolitical issues completely unrelated to the economic project. And so historically, the US has not had that kind of pressure that they brought to bear that in quite that transactional way, and has also not typically politicized the flow of energy the way Russia has with natural gas in Europe. And so I think there are geopolitical advantages that the US can bring. And it's a very, then it becomes a very challenging issue for countries like Kazakhstan who need to be on good terms with neighbors. Part of that means having powerful partners and friends out of their region, like the US, like Europe, like Japan. And so I think it's very wise for Kazakhstan to be considering a multi-dimensional nuclear approach, and hopefully very soon. And the IDAR mentioned the State Department's first program. Hopefully that will lay the foundation for some serious vendors of small modular reactors to see Kazakhstan as a good source, as a good partner, as a good export possibility, and a chance to build those generational relationships that come with reactor exports.
Thank you. And U.S. Development Finance Corporation, are they supporting this kind of projects?
They are, but not in the kind of large way that a state-backed, state-owned enterprise can do. And so the World Bank has recently made a change in its longstanding policy of not investing in nuclear energy. So that can be a piece of resource. So it's going to, for major financial support for the U.S., for U.S.-based technology, it's going to take more work for everybody to assemble the existing parts and pieces of U.S. government support, International Development Bank support. The Asian Development Bank has also followed in the footsteps of the World Bank when it comes to reversing the nuclear energy process. So it's going to be a more challenging financial picture. And so I think that's why the U.S. needs to be really attractive in terms of the technologies, and to be able to present this longstanding safety and security culture as part of the benefits that come with a U.S. Nuclear export partner.
Great. Aidar, what would be your recommendation to the Kazakh government, Uzbek government, the governments, to wait, to move ahead faster, kind of to prepare? Because I think it's quite certain that that U.S. companies will have good offers very soon. So what would be the kind of the right approach? I know the sensitivity of your position, but
yeah, definitely. Like Nargiz, you know that in Astana we discuss a lot about these decisions, like made by Uzbekistan government, and then like what follows from the Kazakhstan side as well. From the technical perspective, having a different technologies, it's a huge challenge. In some countries, it's like works, but with Kazakhstan, we will see having a VVR type reactor from Rosatom, and then CNNC has multiple different designs, but Kazakhstan government hasn't decided on which they will go, whether it's like a large nuclear power plant or SMR. That's another like huge topic to discuss, honestly. But definitely like having a balanced approach and involving the third, countries for the third project, whether it's like again South Korea or Western countries, since Kazakhstan government is looking to their so-called like a short list for the third project as well. So along with the South Korean, definitely they have such designs like NuScales or Haltex and G-Hitachis. We all know that these are all main candidates. There are a lot of developments within the G-Hitachi. We see that in Almaty, in Institute of Nuclear Physics, Kazakhstan has initiated an establishment of the SMR simulator based on the Haltex SMR 300 design. So this is also an important step, or even a signal, we can say. So the balanced approach, as Nargiz, you just wisely mentioned, it's sometimes very difficult or even impossible. But Kazakhstan government is decisive on that. And we will see from the regulatory body perspective, Kazakhstan is now putting a lot of effort, whether on the regulatory framework or on the experts in the national level. These inspectors, they are going to enlarge. So these are important. From the Uzbekistan perspective, you know that they have some recent change on the designs. They were going with the VVR 1200s, now switching to VVR 1000 and adding Russian SMR designs, rhythm 200. But again, probably they are more focusing from the technical perspective. So it will be easier them to supervise and control these all nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants they are looking at. So my advice would be probably going with Kazakhstan's approach, having more balanced, in my a humble opinion. Thank you.
Aidar, is there cooperation between inside Central Asia on that, or body cooperation or anything coordination maybe?
For the last years, we are highlighting the importance of the regional platform among the nuclear community we have in countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and now Kyrgyzstan as well, and Tajikistan also has a lot of inherited from the Soviet Union in sense of the uranium mining, definitely. There were some traditional platforms coming from CIS Atom, SNG Atom they called, but they are not quite active during the last years. So IEA tried to establish some such a platform, but they work on the uranium legacy sites in Vienna very closely, but not on the nuclear power projects or from the regulatory framework or legal framework side. I'm comparing with other regions, whether it's a Middle East or Asia Pacific. They do have very active, for example, Arabic Atomic Energy Agency as a non-profit supporting, and then Afghan is doing really great. ASEAN does a lot in the regional level, having a memorandum of understanding with the IEA and bringing IEA experts for the regional different events. In the Central Asia, definitely as an international science and technology center, we see a lot of opportunities to facilitate these all regional level discussions, and looking forward to put our contribution to that discussions.
One more question. Oh, yes.
Point out that the regionalization of procurement can actually help overcome some of the challenging cost issues. One of the first 2 or 3 or 5 of these new small reactors that are going to be built are not going to have the same benefits that you have if you can have an order book that you have a contract for 10 reactors. Not every country can absorb 10, but a group of countries could absorb 10, and then you can build a factory. You can start to get the benefits of serial production, and you can start to drive that price right down. And so I really agree with Idar that there are benefits that can come, and that those benefits can kind of balance out the question you asked earlier about having too much diversity within a specific country of different types of nuclear reactors, different technologies, that if you have friends and neighbors around that are also using that same technology, that can help improve on supply chain, on training, on operational experience exchange, and all of the things that go into having a long-term, profitable, safe, and high production reactor.
And that would be such a good feed to the efforts to create the regional power system, the regional, have coordinated power grids to help with the with energy security, but also with the energy transition. Because together, we have these resources can be very complementary: hydro, nuclear, right, and renewable solar, wind, and so on. Thinking this regional framework is much more beneficial for everybody. It would be really a win-win. One more little question. Well, it was mentioned that Kazakhstan is the major producer of uranium, and now I think a quarter of American nuclear power plants they use Kazakh uranium, or 25, or maybe a quarter of uranium used by US nuclear power plants. I think something like that. But how do we transport, the uranium to the United States? There are some. Well, the middle corridor is a difficult is a difficult route. It's a challenging route. There have been complaints about it. There were some discussions about transporting via China. How realistic is that? So if you can say a couple of words about that, that would be great. The practical issues. How do we work together?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the regional challenges that you speak of, but I think it's important to remember that that not all of the enriched uranium that the United States uses is enriched in the United States. So some of it doesn't change the nature of the transport program, but some of, there's enrichment capability that the U.S. depends upon the plants are located in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands, as well as plants in the United States. So it's really a global system. But you're right to point out that global system relies on the ability for that uranium to get out of the Central Asia region and into those other locations.
Idar, if you can say a couple of words, and then we'll do the last round. Yeah.
So here in Astana, we regularly hear that Kazatomprom, being a national operator for uranium export, so they are trying to put the eggs not only in one a basket. So they try to enhance the optional roads, because the main road goes from St. Petersburg, as you all know, from Russia. And there is a huge effort to use the middle corridor, through Azerbaijan and Georgia, and they're doing really great on that. But the third kind of an option using the China is under the big question mark, since the Chinese government is not maybe not the government itself, but there are like very intensive negotiations coming, not only for years, it's decades probably, but it's an important to mention that there are ongoing discussions. But I would also add the importance of the statements coming from the President of Republic of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, who is highlighting the importance of the nuclear fuel cycle, covering not only the mining, milling, or like a conversion. It covers also the enrichment, and Kazakhstan also put it as a like a strategic goal for the future to create such a nuclear fuel cycle hub in the country, since the natural uranium itself comes from the mainly from the southern part of Kazakhstan, maybe, to not only fabricate the fuel assemblies in the country, but having plants, uranium conversion plants, and enrichment plants in the country. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're a little bit over time, but let's insert one more question, Adam, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, it's just one more question that we've been getting kind of from the Q&A side of things. Many people are sort of interested in the implications of, what's going on in the Middle East. We've seen the targeting of nuclear facilities, but, we've also seen kind of in Ukraine with Russia occupying nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. So these sort of what are the implications of these geopolitical developments for nuclear safety? Maybe Ambassador Holgate.
Yeah, this is a fascinating issue, and one that has the potential to really change everybody's thinking about nuclear energy. After Russia attacked and then illegally seized the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, to me it was really an open question of whether that would depress what was already growing as an interest in nuclear energy, or whether it would feed it. And it turns out it was the second. It's really fed it because people were looking at the possibility of energy independence. That was, and also the recognition of the historical, excellent safety track record of power plants globally. And so we've seen that has even more fully driven an interest in nuclear energy as an aspect of energy security. What we're seeing right now in the Middle East is with the restrictions on oil coming out of that region, I think is a similar driver. Now that's expressing itself not only in a nuclear way. I saw a report the other day about massive increases in solar panel orders going to China. And so I don't think it's going to be an entirely nuclear outcome, but I think it's going to add to that interest in nuclear, as for countries that are extremely dependent on fossil fuel imports, adding that nuclear capability, nuclear technology as part of an energy security. Now that will completely change, in my view, if there is a significant nuclear accident that comes out of either of these wars. There's much too much cavalier statements about targeting, both statements and behavior about explosions nearby these facilities, whether or not the facilities are actually intentionally targeted. Anytime you have a hot war happening near a nuclear reactor, that's a really bad thing. And I think that needs to be incorporated as we think about moving nuclear energy to new countries, because if you look at the, just kind of global stability scales that are out there, about 50 countries currently have nuclear technology installations of some type or another. That next 50 are almost all less secure, less stable geopolitically. And so the security risks to those reactors in those countries, coming from regional or internal strife, could be significantly higher than those in the countries that already have nuclear infrastructure. And so that needs to be understood, in, again, pushing back to the design phase of these reactors, that it's not, it's a new environment, a different environment than what we've been building in up until now.
Thank you so much. Yes, Aydar,
if
sorry.
I may to add, I had a huge pleasure to be one of the hundreds of different staff contributing to the Ukraine missions. So I visited Ukraine twice through that IAEA missions, being in Kiev and Chernobyl, and spending my 2 months there, being I can call that that lack of legal framework protecting the nuclear facilities during the armed conflict is now resolved through such an approach from the IAEA, being a life, I don't know, protectors, having a UN passport and being there. It's definitely a challenging approach, but IAEA doing a lot. And I'm quite sure that in coming months or years, there will be some a newer approach presented for the discussion among the international community on such an a problem.
Aydar, thank you for your service in that respect. It's been amazing how the IAEA has stepped up in the Ukraine context, and the individuals who are spending time there, of DG Grossi and his very careful definition of the 7 pillars, and the ability these are derived from existing, guidance and standards. This is not something new, which prevented the Russians from, opposing them up until recently. So, I mean, it's been astonishing how the IAEA has really stepped up in that situation. And I want to thank you for your personal courage and contributions to that, Aydar.
It's a huge pleasure. Thank you.
Can I also thank you both for your service and making the world safer. And also thank you so much for doing this event with us. I think we learned a lot. It was extremely informative and insightful. Let me thank Adam, my partner in crime. Well, so that's not a good way of putting it, but my partner in this program, and also thank Laura Sargent and Eva Fally, our events team, who helped to put this together. Thank you so much, and thank you, the audiences, for tuning in and for